This is running stitch. This is two, and this two, and all that beautiful texture and all those gorgeous patterns. Running stitch is often the first embroidery stitch that people learned. I know I learned it when I was a little girl. Let me show you how it works. I'm going to be working on this sample piece that already has quite a bit of running stitch on it. And I'm going to be using the 6-stranded embroidery cotton. And pro tip, if you don't want your threads to end up in a big tangle mess like that, wind them onto a piece of card like this before you start working. I'm not going to start out with a really long length of thread, and I'll explain that in a little while. This sort of thread comes in 6 strands. I'm going to use 4 so that it's a little bit easier for you to see, but I usually use either 2 or 3 strands, and sometimes 1, depending on how bold I want my line to be. So what kind of needle am I going to be using? I don't know. One that has a big enough eye for me to poke the threads through rather easily, but not so big that it gets hard to sew through the cloth. And I'm starting off by taking a few small stitches, one over each other, to secure my thread at the back, and I usually find 3 to work. The little tiny stitches will lie flat and you won't have a lump on the back, but if you'd rather tie a knot, that's entirely up to you. This is a do what you like situation. And while Sierra keeps an eye on me, let me show you how to do the stitch. So to get started, you bring your needle up on your cloth wherever you want to start, and then you just poke it back in, and then you bring it back up again. Now I like to do this sort of little rocking motion where I poke my needle through the cloth and then just rock the fabric to bring it back up on top. But if you prefer, you can poke it through, pull it back to the back, and then bring it back up to the front. How big should your stitches be? Doesn't matter, and don't at all worry about whether they're the same length or going in a perfectly straight line. None of that really matters. All of those details will come with practice. So now let's mix things up. Let's try doing a really big stitch on the back and a tiny little stitch on the front. See what you think of that. And then you can reverse it and do a really big stitch on the front and a tiny little stitch on the back, and see what happens when you do that. Are there any other variations that you can think of? And now, if this is as much complexity as you can manage, don't worry about that at all. But let me suggest a few other things for you to try as well. You can try loading up several stitches on your needle at once before you pull through, and that's a little bit faster. Now, the longer your needle is, the more stitches you can load up, so that might be a consideration in what needle you choose. You can also start intentionally stitching not in a straight line. You can do a curved line. You can zigzag back and forth if you like. You can do all kinds of things. Now you may have noticed that the running stitch makes sort of a dashed line. It's not a solid line. And if you want to make that line more of a solid line, you can do something called a double running stitch. And the way that works is you turn your cloth around and you start stitching back along the line, filling in the spaces that you left behind. And if you want to be very precise and insert your needle right at the beginning and the end of the stitches that are there, you will get a very solid line. And if you're off by a bit, that's not a big deal. Maybe you'll discover something interesting. Who knows? I'm getting to the end of my thread, so I'm just going to take a few small stitches, one over the top of each other on the back, in the same way as I did when I started, to secure off my thread. And now I'm going to switch to another color, and this is the reason that I mentioned to not start out with a really long thread. This gives me an opportunity to try out some different colors or different kinds of thread. Try out different things and see what you like. I'm still using the 6-stranded embroidery thread, but this time I'm using just 2 strands, and it makes a much thinner line. Now I'm going to try out another variation on that double running stitch, sometimes called Holbein stitch, named after a painter who used to like to do paintings of people wearing clothing decorated with this stitch. So I'm still doing a running stitch, but you'll notice that I'm changing the direction of my needle with every stitch. So I'm ending up with a series of stepped dashed lines. And if you don't feel like you want to do this, you absolutely don't have to try it out. I'm just offering this as something that you might want to try out if you're looking for a bit of a challenge. But if you're brand new to stitching, this may not be the time for you to do this stitch. You might want to come back to it at some time in the future. So after I've done those dashes, I'm going back and filling in the gaps in the opposite direction. So my first pass created horizontal stitches, and on my return path back, I'm filling in with the vertical stitches. And now when I feel like I've finished that, I can create another one beside it. And my stitches aren't perfect, and I don't worry about that at all. And there are definitely ways that you can make your stitches more regular, like these patterns here. And I'll talk more about that piece in a few weeks. But now I'd like to tell you about a long-term project that I'm about to start, where I'll be exploring all kinds of different embroidery stitches and fabric techniques. I'm just about finished with this piece that I've been working on over the last year, and I've really liked the way that it turned out, but I haven't really enjoyed all of the stitches that I've used in this piece. Some of them are rather complicated. So I thought I'd like to do something similar, but use just very simple basic embroidery stitches. And I'll be starting with running stitch and using it in all kinds of different ways. What different ways? I don't know yet. We'll have to wait and see. My Ko-fi subscribers get early access to my videos, and there'll also be a few bonuses there for them every month. And I'd love to have you join us over there. And I'll be working on this piece of cloth that already has some stitching on it. And I mentioned in a previous video that if you didn't have something like that and you wanted to stitch along, you could perhaps use a piece of clothing. However, I will warn you that your piece of clothing may end up looking something like this. And now I'd like to tell you about a really beautiful project that involves 25 million running stitches, one stitch for every refugee in the world in 2019. There are so many more now, and I'll leave a link to the website for this project and for the artist who initiated it, Jennifer Kim Sung. I'd highly recommend watching the videos for the project and checking out Jennifer's other artist activist work. And I'd like to share this with you now.